Sir Kannan Gopalakrishnan. He was working as a senior architect at Engineering Design Research Centre, L&T Construction, India's largest construction company. He's also worked on projects ranging from institutional buildings to international airports, apartment complexes to aircraft hangars. He's also attended 3 international conferences and 2 national conferences, and has also presented technical papers at the Jawaharlal Nehru University, Delhi, and the MSRIT, Bangalore. He's also won the national championship at Archaman at the India's largest architecture quiz. Sir Kannan Gopalakrishnan currently runs a design firm, Habitat Design Studio, and he is also a visiting faculty at the renowned architecture schools in Tamil Nadu.
Welcome to UGC lecture series. This is AR 6006 Structure and Architecture. We have already looked at units 3 and 4 in the previous episodes. We are now going to unit 5, which is actually seminars, but there are a few important things in this unit which we are not going to miss. So, I am just taking one lecture and try to cover the important aspects of seminars, but nevertheless this entire unit is all about you people, because based on what we have learned so far and based on your study further, you should be able to take a look at these topics and you should be able to present them on your own understanding and on your own learning. Nevertheless, we will discuss on a certain aspects in this episode which I am sure you will find it interesting. In the previous episode, we remember looking at Jean Marie Chibao Cultural Center, and in this episode we will be looking at study of architectural form and structural expression, structural analysis and philosophy, building envelope, services, construction sequence. We won't be covering the entire contents of this unit as such, because the entire contents of the unit as such is primarily for your reference and for your seminar topics, but I will be covering very brief topics and very little items from this list, because these are some things which I think are very important for you to understand. So, let us look at these subjects directly. Form continuum. Professor David Billington is a famous personality. He proposed that sculptural form, architectural form, structural form, these three are linked in a continuum: sculptural, architectural, structural. These three are completely related in a continuum. All three of these forms are designed. Sculpture is designed, architecture is designed, structure is designed. They are all three-dimensional structures. Certainly, because of these very strong similarity, because they are all designed and they are all three-dimensional structures, the dividing lines between these three may be little confusing, may be a little blurred. Yet there are hallmarks defining each of these types of form that can be generally agreed upon. There are certain uniquely identifying factors. Let us take a look at architectural form. Architectural form is dictated by architectural purposes, such as the practicalities of spatial organization and control of the flow of occupants. Architectural form also concerns with the sense of space of a structure that creates its symbolism and its relationship to the setting. So, what they identify here is architectural form is always dictated by architecture purpose. What exactly is an architecture purpose? Architecture purpose can be of many types. The most common types are function. A place needs to perform a role because there is a series of activities that are supposed to happen in a space. So, that particular space should be effective of use for that particular function to happen, because space is the host here. The host needs to allow the event to happen, only then a host makes sense to us. So, function is the primary architectural purpose. A secondary architectural purpose, like what they explain, is about symbolism, about aesthetics, and relationship to the setting. An architecture, if it doesn't have any relationship to the setting, is useless, because setting is very important for an architecture project. Otherwise, it becomes irrelevant to the context. Setting could mean environmental setting, it could be cultural setting, it could be historic setting, it could be an economical setting, it could be a political setting, it could be setting which is intangible forms, symbolism, emotional setting. These are all different settings which architecture has to respond to. Let's look at the other forms which architecture concerns itself with. Architectural form can lean toward a sculptural form, as in the case where architectural elements are exaggerated, or when forms reflect non-efficient use of material just for the sake of emotional impact. Let's say I am designing a building and I am making a certain element of the building very big or very small, or exaggerate it in a place where I exaggerate it not because it has any structural reason or any architectural reason, but simply for the sake of emotional impact, simply for someone to say, okay, this building looks beautiful, this building looks monstrous, this building looks nasty, this building looks subtle, just for people to use say an adjective if I exaggerate a certain element into sculptural form. Now, architectural form has slightly exaggerated itself and become a sculpture. So, you sometimes wonder whether this is a high form of sculpture, or is it somewhere between sculpture and architecture, whereas in essence the building is still technically useful. Technically, the building has to house people, people have to move around, activities have to happen inside, all those things has to happen. But architectural form is always at least somewhat functional. It is always three-dimensional, and typically it is client driven. It must satisfy the needs of the client and the occupants. Yet, it must also satisfy artistic and creative goals of the architect. Finally, it needs to be safe, since it ultimately will be used by people. Let us go on to structural form and see what structural form is about. Structural form is dictated by structural needs, just as architectural form is dictated by architectural needs. Structural form is dictated by structural needs, primarily to support gravity and lateral loads, and usually also the need to provide a building envelope for shelter against the elements. Carefully designed structural form can exhibit the stark beauty of controlled strength, even to the point of excitement. Structure can define the visual impact of a building, as in the case of large exposed columns which give the appearance of strength and solidity, or the case of tall center columns which can create an elegant loggia effect. Clearly, structural elements can definitely give an impact. There are entire buildings that stand on one single column. There are buildings that even fall even if after putting 100 columns. Structural form is dictated by structural needs. It has to support the building, it has to support gravity, it has to support loads, lateral loads, wind loads, all kinds of loads. Also, it needs to protect the inhabitants of the building against shelter, against the elements. Again, sometimes the structure can also create beauty. The structure can also create sentiments in people. Structural form is mathematically based. It seeks the greatest efficiency, economy and elegance that the designer can create. It is not random, it is not generated by trial and error, it is not subject to changes in taste or fashion, it is not symbolic of some anthropomorphic idea. An architectural form that veers towards sculptural form has that of whose dimensions and geometry are chosen not because of limitations of material or workers' skills. Often, in spite of these very limitations, they still do. Structure is made subservient to design which finds its logic in the architect's particular aesthetic thought. Here we have clearly defined the boundaries of structural form, because It's mathematically formed, it is not random, it is not trial and error, it is not subject to taste and fashion, it does not have any anthropomorphic idea, it is not concerned with emotion, it is to only consider efficiency, economy and elegance of the designer. Now, if an architect has to veer the concept towards a sculptural form, make it interesting by exaggerating certain forms and changing the dimensions and geometry to his whims and fancies, in spite of all the differences in the way of people working and everything, the structural form is made subservient to a design which finds its logic not in its primary use, but also in the architect's particular aesthetic thought, the way in which architect has chosen the aesthetic. So, here the structural form becomes a subservient to the architectural form. Sculptural form, there may or may not be a client involved in a sculptural form. There is typically no function associated with the sculptural form except for certain kinetic sculptures where if a sculpture needs to pour water, it has to throw water. The designer is free to make any and all decisions about the form, with virtually the only constraint being the sculpture must stand on its own. Otherwise, the designer can make any changes to the sculpture which he wants. That is the freedom in which a sculpture can work. Architect does not have this kind of freedom, although some modern architects do, but most of the architects don't have this freedom of choosing whatever form, because an architect's form has to necessarily perform a function, whereas in sculpture there is typically no function. Let us look at the role of structure. At first glance, structure only provides stability to the building, and it cannot be the creator of architectural space. Such an approach creates the border between structure and architecture. In the past, due to the lack of coordination between structure and architecture, due to the structural limitation, many buildings did not finish, and in fact, architecture had lost its identity and become a horizontal and vertical cover to the building structure. Because structure and architecture did not coordinate, what happened was the structure was made and architecture was the cover. There is a horizontal cover, there is a vertical cover to the building structure which was there, and structure had all the elements of other things. In the past, that is primarily because there is no coordination between architecture and structure. Sometimes also what happens in the modern context, there is this building which has beautiful architecture, and the building cannot finish because it does not it does not coordinate itself with the structure. Both can happen. Also, in the cases of lack of coordination between structure and architecture, after the implementation of the building, it would totally ruin quickly because of the absence of adequate strength and stability. In fact, the former executive architectural metaphor, not mathematical equations. As the time passed, modern architectural thinking and the subsequent formation of new architectural ideas such as high-tech architecture, deconstructivism, folding, and new horizons appeared in the area, and architectural space and structure were considered from a new point of view. The new point of view being architecture and structure are merely one, and one needs to understand architecture and structure completely together so that he can look at the building in a proper manner. So, this created a very, very new and interesting point of view. There are two places in the past. One is where there is a building and architecture forms a skin, and it just becomes a clothing material which the structure wears. Or another place where there is a beautiful piece of architecture and it completely ruins quickly because it does not have the strength and stability to stand. Between these two rises the new kind of thing, which is the new point of view of these two ideas, where the new idea which was created, styles such as high-tech architecture, deconstructivism, they all looked at structure and architecture as an integrated element, and it changed the way we looked at buildings. Structure and architecture are two key components in shaping building formation according to these styles. Interaction and conflict between the two components and their balanced growth in the manufacturing process and the development of construction technologies has led to the creation of new generation of buildings with advanced technological in structure. structural design, structural requirements impose the form and format logic that has been praised and admired as a part of visual language. There are different types of structure where you can express structure as a design. Structural elements are selected and controlled primarily by visual standards. Then structure as a design is expressed. Then there is a neglected structure. Structure is ignored during design of the building and will not be considered as a part of the aesthetic program. Then there is accepted structure. Structural requirements may considerably affect the form of the building even if the structure is not necessarily exposed. Then there is structure as productive forms. This option is the same as in part of a complex structural phenomenon in which structure also adds productive value to the design. Here is where the structure and architecture, there is a holy matrimony between them, and here is where they start to become productive. In this context, paying attention to the high-tech architectural thinking, which is another way of thinking about the structure of architecture, which is essential because we need to think of structure as architecture itself, because architects consider high-tech as the greatest achievement of modernity and the most important factor in the development of 20th century. According to them, the extract and physical characteristics of each era has embodied architecture of that particular period. For example, Greek temples with their perfect fit with the geometrical regularities, elaboration of ancient Greek perfectionist mentality. Greeks were perfectionists, so they tried to create the perfection in all the buildings that they produced. Similarly, for modern buildings, they should represent the mental and technical essence of the present age of technology, which means the present age of technology, which is very important, like the way the building stands, the structural elements, the HVAC elements, the fire elements, the way in which the building runs, the electronic lines, the electrical conduits, all those things are the things which makes the modern function work. So, in high-tech architecture, what people did was they turned them all inside out. Inside out architecture was another name that was given to high-tech architecture. So, they turned everything inside out, in which you can actually see all the conduits and all the electrical HVAC lines on the naked ceiling, because that is what they believed in, to be truthful to what you do. Greek temples were based on geometric regularities because those people were perfectionists, and our buildings should show off the technical essence of modern day technology because we are in that age. That is what the style represented. And here is a few list of things that was very particular about high-tech architecture. They were optimistic about the progress of science and technology, representing technology as extract and achievement of the new era, representing building process, transparency, layering, displaying the movement of the building, representing the structure and components of the building in facade and in plan, using simple and bright colors, structure and construction as the design, applying light, tensile elements, separating the service provider parts from the parts that needs to be serviced, roof design after the fifth facade. These are certain elements which were incorporated in this kind of structure. Let us take a look at few examples in this particular typology. Santiago Calatrava designed the Elko City Hall by recreating the human body in design, the presence of structural as the base of the design itself. Norman Foster designed the HSBC Bank in Shanghai. We saw this example earlier in one of our lectures. Used technology, technique as a constant. All parts of the building are non-decorative and are highly functional. Herzog and Muron designed the Bird's Nest Stadium in China, Beijing. They used the facade as the main structure, designing the outer crust of the building itself. So, these are famous examples of how structure can be cleverly used within the building envelope, within the building program itself, to make very interesting designs. It all depends on how you wish to take it forward. Let's take a look at space and architecture. Space is the beginning and ending of architecture. Thus, the spatial definition in our terms is a means criticizing and judging the effectiveness of the architecture. Space and vacuity are the key factor in architecture, and they are considered natural, because architecture is not just art, and it is not just the picture of life or the life we or others have passed, but it is an environment, a scene. According to the theory proposed by Marcus Vitruvius Polio, architecture based on combining three elements of performance: stability, beauty of architectural form, performance must meet all these three elements, and are necessarily they must coincide. The famous Vitruvian trio says utilitas, formitas and venustas. Utilitas meaning utility or commodity, formitas meaning firmness or the structural integrity, or venustas is the Venus, the beauty. So, commodity, firmness and delight are the famous Vitruvian triad, which is essential for any building to work. Structure is the design of forms with different materials that provides various load bearing and horizontal parts of the roof. Thus, understanding of the structure as well as architecture demands elegance, taste, art and creativity. Structures are architected before being calculated. The geometry of the structure has to provide the aesthetic. Nowadays, the structure of the building is presented in architectural designs, and sometimes the architecture is born out of the structure, like the Crystal Palace or the Eiffel Tower. In both cases, the architectural space is created by the structural element. Human specific environment is created when it is created by a human made structure, because human beings move and that determines our reaction to it. From the perspective of structuralism, the architectural space created through interaction of a human being with his environment is kept at a technical or artificial totality. The components of architectural space interact between human form and environment. In this system, structure protects the form of the elements, and total system the main factor of defining the space, scope or body that the architectural space is willing to define. The human space architecture components are form and environment. Therefore, it is important that the spatial constructions be interactive with the human. If the building does not consider human characteristics and pays attention to other criteria, it will face human reactions and will become rendered useless. Any building that you design should have human characteristics, because when you have created a building, when you have created a space, the space is used predominantly 90% of the cases by humans, very rarely by just furniture and other things, and very rarely by other animal races, but predominantly 95% of architecture is used by humans, and if we don't belong there, we will certainly react to it, and the building will be rendered useless if our reaction is not positive. The architectural space identity depends on its structure, and the function of structure and geometry are the factors of space design, and thus interaction of space and structure is necessary in creating human space. They say that architectural space identity depends on structure and function. For structure, geometry and space is the major factor. So, thus there needs to be a common ground between all these factors. Sometimes structure becomes the center of attention, and sometimes it is neglected during the process, but it must be confirmed that the best structure is the one that is accepted and synchronized by architecture. There are cases in the world where structure itself becomes the center of attention, like your Eiffel Tower. Sometimes structure is completely neglected in the process of building, just like those buildings that keep falling. We hear about them in the news every now and then. But the best product is achieved when you combine structure and architecture. Best of structure and best of architecture should come together to give you the best of a building. With this, we come to an end of the lecture series. You should have learnt about understanding the syntax of sculptural design. structural design and architectural design and how they work in tandem. You should have understood the complex relationship between the structure and architecture, trying to appreciate the best of both in a building without any bias. With that, you should be able to answer these two questions. Explain the famous form continuum. Why is structure so very important in architecture? How can it help the architecture of a building? You should be able to answer these questions at ease. And with this lecture, we come to an end of this lecture series. Structure and Architecture AR6006 comes to an end with this. We have been looking at different examples and different things in this lecture series, starting from how barely we begun from the early civilizations to how modern day architecture, famous architects like Norman Foster, Richard Rogers, Renzo Piano perform their buildings. We have seen the entire history abridged in these 18 lectures. Hope you will do some more research into these projects. Hope you do some more research into these concepts and try to become better architects by integrating structure in your architecture. Thank you.